Welcome to the debate. So today we're stepping into a territory that, it feels incredibly modern, but you could argue it has roots as old as human society itself. We are looking at the concept of personal branding. Now, if you look at the source material, the definition seems pretty innocent. It describes personal branding as a strategic process, one aimed at creating, positioning, and maintaining a positive public perception of yourself. It's about leveraging your unique characteristics to present a story, basically to tell your story on your own terms.
It does sound clean when you put it that way. It sounds like empowerment. But as we really dig into the material, we find that it's far more than just polishing a resume or picking a good profile picture. We're talking about a fundamental shift in how human beings relate to one another, and maybe more importantly, how they relate to themselves. So the central question we have to wrestle with today is pretty stark. Is personal branding a necessary act of, quote, proper care of the self and professional empowerment in our digital age, or is it the commodification of the self, a process where complex humans are just reduced to products, packaged and sold?
I think you probably know where I stand on this. I look at the literature, especially the history of the concept, and I see personal branding as a vital tool. Absolutely vital for professional advancement. We live in a crowded, noisy world. If you don't define who you are, believe me, someone else will define it for you, and they probably won't be as generous. For me, branding is the only real way to build trust and to differentiate. It's a path to freedom professionally.
And I come at it from a very different angle. I see the language of marketing, products, packaging, added value being applied to the human soul. I'm going to argue that personal branding encourages this kind of performative behavior. It creates a deep artificiality, and it forces people into a state of constant, unpaid labor just to maintain an image that might not even be real. It turns your life into a pitch deck.
All right, let's dive in then. Because I think to really get why personal branding is necessary, and why I'd argue it's actually a pretty natural evolution of work, we have to look at where it all came from. The source material points us back to 1981 with Al Rice and Jack Trout's book, Positioning, The Battle for Your Mind. They basically made the point that a positioning strategy wasn't just for, soap or cars. It could be used to advance a career. But the real explosion, the moment this went from a niche idea to a cultural mandate, that came with Tom Peters.
The brand you philosophy.
Exactly. In 1997, and then later in his 1999 book, The Brand You 50, Peters coined that phrase. And you have to understand the context of the late 90s corporate world. The whole idea of the company man was dying out. Peters argued for transforming yourself from just a cog in a machine, an employee who's dependent on a boss, into a distinct entity. He said we must differentiate ourselves. The material highlights that personal branding is often framed in these marketing terms, like added value and promise. Now, I know you take issue with those terms.
I certainly do.
But just think about what they actually represent. They represent agency. Effective branding is simply effective self-presentation. It's about highlighting your knowledge, your experience, and your skills to establish a credible image. It's about taking control of your own narrative rather than letting some corporation decide what you're worth.
I see why you think that. And I get the desire for agency. I really do. But let me offer a different perspective on that terminology. When we start using words like packaging and product to describe a human being, we aren't just using metaphors. We're fundamentally changing the nature of the subject. The material points out a really critical distinction between self-promotion and self-expression.
Okay, walk me through how you see that difference, because to me, they can bleed into each other pretty easily.
Well, I think they're fundamentally different impulses. Self-expression is often unintentional. It just sort of arises naturally from who you are. It's you laughing at a joke or sharing a song you love because it moved you, or just venting about a bad day. It's messy. Self-promotion, especially in the context of branding, is deliberate in every single regard. It's a conscious, careful crafting of a persona. Success in this world is seen as just effective self-packaging.
But isn't all social interaction a form of packaging? We wear certain clothes, we comb our hair.
There's a huge difference between combing your hair and structuring your entire personality around market viability. My concern, and it's one that's echoed in the text, is that treating yourself as a brand invites the ambivalence of consumerism right into your personal identity. We start judging human value by the same rubric we use for a toaster or a pair of sneakers: ranking, evaluation, judgment. When David McNally and Carl Speak describe a personal brand as a perception or emotion maintained by somebody other than you, they're essentially saying your identity belongs to the market now. You're outsourcing your own self-worth to your audience.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. You see it as surrendering your identity to the market. I see it as engaging with the reality of the modern workplace. We can't just pretend the digital economy doesn't exist. The material makes it very, very clear. Employers are increasingly using social media to vet applicants. They're looking at Facebook, Twitter, doing background checks. A standout resume simply isn't enough anymore. You need a LinkedIn profile that actually showcases your expertise. You need a consistent professional presence online.
Right, and I'm not denying that employers do this. I'm questioning the toll it takes on the individual to live under that kind of microscope 24/7.
But look at the benefits beyond just avoiding the negative. Building a brand isn't just about getting a job. The text mentions that building an online presence inside corporate networks even lets people connect with colleagues socially and professionally. It can spur innovation because employees learn from each other. This online social value, it can transform into real-world rewards. It's not just vanity, it's utility. If you share your expertise online, you help others, and you build a reputation for yourself. That's a win-win.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's purely utility without a massive psychological cost. You mentioned online social value, but let's talk about the labor required to generate that value. As social media becomes the main vehicle for this branding, the material notes that we begin to see the maintenance of our online brand as a job. It is labor. Specifically, it's what sociologists call immaterial labor.
Immaterial labor?
Yes, it's the work that produces the informational and cultural content of the commodity. And in this case, you are the commodity. We're turning our very existence into work. Every dinner, every vacation, every single thought becomes potential content to maintain the brand. And it's not just work, it's a specific kind of pressure to conform.
Conform to what? Professional standards?
To conform to what's called context collapse. This is a vital concept from the material that we really need to explain. In the physical world, you have different contexts, right? You speak one way to your boss, another way to your toddler, and a totally different way to your friends at a bar. Those are separate spheres.
Right, that's just natural code switching.
Exactly. But on platforms like Twitter or LinkedIn, those contexts collapse. You have one flattened, all-encompassing audience. Your boss, your mother, your college friends, your industry peers. They are all watching the same feed. And this creates a professional environment with potential professional costs for any personal expression. You can't just be yourself. You have to be a sanitized version of yourself that appeals to everyone all at once. That isn't freedom, like Tom Peters promised. That's a cage. You become the lowest common denominator of your own personality.
Okay, but I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it feels like you're assuming that curation equals falsity. We curate ourselves in job interviews on dates at Thanksgiving dinner. And this brings us to the concept of disclosure. The material actually references Michel Foucault, a heavy hitter in philosophy, and his idea of the proper care of the self.
Foucault is often misused in corporate speak, but please go on.
The argument is that transparency, giving your viewers a complete view of your life, is actually a form of authenticity. By allowing the outside world access to your inner self, you build trust. The text says these postings form a digital archive of the self. This allows for a really robust construction of identity. So it's not about hiding, it's about sharing. And in a world where connection is currency, that sharing is valuable. Foucault's idea of care of the self was about governing yourself ethically, while managing your brand is a form of that governance.
That is a compelling way to put it, but have you considered the paradox of authenticity? The material raises this explicitly. When authenticity is performed for an audience, it inherently becomes artificial.
Explain that paradox. How can being authentic be artificial?
Because the moment you consciously decide to show everyone how authentic you are engaging in a performance. Think about the messy desk photo on Instagram. Someone takes a picture of their messy desk to say, "Look, I'm real, I'm disorganized just like you." But they probably spent 10 minutes arranging the lighting and moving the coffee cup to the perfect spot to look authentically messy. The presentation of the self is shaped by the platform's logic, what gets likes, what gets shared, and by audience expectation, not by truth.
But surely there's room for genuine connection within that framework. Not everyone is staging their coffee cups.
The text suggests that social networks allow the freedom to disclose an inauthentic self. There can be a complete disconnect between the person and the brand. You can curate a digital archive that looks authentic, but is entirely fabricated. And this brings us right back to my core fear, the commodification of the self. We are marketing identities like they're commercial goods. If I change my personality because I know it will poll better on LinkedIn, have I cared for myself, as Foucault suggested, or have I sold myself?
I think you're assuming the worst of people's intentions there. I think most people are trying to align their public image with their private reality. But let's look at the mechanics of this, because the material dives deep into how this is actually done. It brings up the importance of consistency. A brand has to be consistent to be trusted.
And that consistency is exactly the trap. This is where Erving Goffman's self-presentation theory becomes absolutely crucial. We need to talk about dramaturgy.
Life is theater?
Precisely. Goffman makes a distinction between the front stage, our curated public behavior where we perform our roles, and the backstage, which is our private behavior where we can finally drop the mask.
Right, and personal branding is essentially the strategic management of that front stage.
Yes, but traditionally, we had a backstage. We could go home, close the door, and just stop performing. Personal branding forces people to live constantly on the front stage. There is no off switch. And the source material uses a very specific, very high-profile example of what happens when the backstage crashes into the front stage. Donald Sterling.
The former LA Clippers owner, yeah.
Right. Here was a man with a public image, a front stage persona, but his private backstage comments, which were racist and deeply offensive, were recorded and made public. And that conflict between the curated brand and the backstage reality completely destroyed his image.
I would argue that the Donald Sterling example actually reinforces my point. It proves that you cannot sustain a fraudulent brand. The goal of personal branding isn't to fake a persona that hides some terrible backstage reality. The goal is to ensure your front stage is a comprehensive professional profile that inspires confidence. If your backstage reality is repugnant, well, that's a character flaw, not a branding flaw.
That's true for Sterling, sure, but apply it to a normal person. The pressure is to never slip, to never have a bad day, to never have a private thought you wouldn't want published. Because if the backstage leaks, the brand collapses.
But that pressure also drives quality. The material talks about visual identity, color schemes, typography, photography. These things evoke specific emotions and create brand loyalty. When it's done right, this isn't about deception, it's about clarity. And look at the examples cited in the text. Kim Kardashian or Donald Trump.
You're bringing out the big guns now.
I am, because the text uses them. And regardless of what you think of their politics or their personalities, they have successfully leveraged their social status and their visual identity for huge financial gain. They prove the efficacy of the model. They have turned online social value into real-world power. They understand that in a media-saturated world, the visual signal, the red hat, the specific aesthetic, it cuts through the noise.
They have. But that brings us back to the question of values. Trump and Kardashian are examples of the triumph of the image. The text notes that celebrities leverage social status for financial gain. But for the average person, who isn't a billionaire or a reality star, this model creates a really precarious existence. You mentioned consistency earlier. The material says, maintained by somebody other than you.
Meaning the audience holds the perception.
Correct. If your brand is a perception held by others, then you are constantly at the mercy of the crowd. You are laboring to keep the visual identity consistent, the tone consistent, the disclosure consistent, all to avoid that context collapse or that backstage leak. It is a high-stress, high-labor way to live. You are effectively working as your own PR firm 24/7 for free.
It is high effort, I'll grant you that. But I would argue it's responsible. The text mentions that even unprofessional behavior on any social media platform can harm career prospects. That is just the reality. We can wish it weren't so, but it is. So taking control of that visual identity, managing that digital footprint, is not just vanity. It is a necessary survival skill in the modern economy. It is how you ensure that the story being told about you is the one you want to be told.
But do you see the circular logic there? We have to brand ourselves because employers look at social media. And employers look at social media because we've all branded ourselves. We are locked in this feedback loop of performative disclosure. We are training ourselves to view our entire lives through the lens of what will this look like on the feed.
I see it as training ourselves to be deliberate, to be conscious of our impact.
I see it as training ourselves to be products.
Let's just look at the influence on careers section again to ground this. It explicitly says that general professional profiles like LinkedIn allow a person to improve their professional standing. It mentions that a customized cover letter and an elevator speech are part of this. These are standard professional tools. If we all accept a resume is necessary, why is a LinkedIn profile suddenly dehumanizing?
Because a resume is a document of what you have done. It's a historical record. A personal brand is a promise of who you are. And when you start selling who you are, you lose something of yourself. The text warns that efforts to express authenticity may paradoxically become artificial. And that is the tragedy of it. The more we try to prove we're real to the market, the less real we become to ourselves. We become avatars.
I think that's a risk, but it's not a certainty. The material also suggests that this interaction allows for employees to build up their personal brand relative to other employees, which can spur innovation. There's a competitive aspect, yes, but competition can drive excellence. If I'm trying to position myself as a thought leader in my industry, I'm motivated to actually become a thought leader. The brand can pull the reality upward.
Where the brand can mask the lack of reality. We see this all the time. People who are famous just for being famous, or experts who are only experts at self-promotion.
That's always a danger, but I choose to focus on the empowerment. The brand you philosophy was about transforming from an employee, someone who is just told what to do, into a brand that shouts distinction, commitment, and passion. That is a powerful message. It says, you matter. Your unique characteristics matter. You're not interchangeable.
It says you matter if you can sell yourself. That's a conditional worth. And that's where I struggle. It implies that if you aren't shouting distinction, you're failing. It turns existence into a sales pitch.
So we're coming up on the end of our time, and I think we've really laid out the core tension here. From my perspective, the source material makes it clear. We live in a digital age where we all have a digital footprint and a physical footprint. Managing that footprint strategically, visually, verbally is just responsible. It's necessary for career success. It's how we navigate a world that relies on signals and trust. We can't really opt out of the reputation economy.
And I would maintain that while we can't fully opt out, we have to remain deeply skeptical of the whole mechanism. The text warns us that we situate the maintenance of our online brand as a job. We have to be wary of viewing our own lives, our private moments, and our relationships through the rubric of products, packaging, and evaluation. If we treat ourselves solely as commodities to be optimized, we risk losing the messy, unmarketable parts of ourselves that make us truly human.
So it's a balance between the strategic self and the authentic self.
A tension between self-branding and self-expression.
And perhaps the listener needs to look at their own social media feed and ask, is this a reflection of who I am, or is this a product I am selling?
A question worth asking every single time we hit post.
Thank you for joining the debate.